Hey there, welcome back. I'm Austin, and this is Animal Quests. Today we're breaking down the 7 stupid tourist selfies made around wild animals, and exactly what happened when the animals responded. From a Dutch logistics supervisor who stepped out of his safari vehicle straight into a hippopotamus's territory, to a French hydrologist who crouched at a riverbank at dusk and was taken by a saltwater crocodile. Let's start with an Australian who left a marked wildlife trail in central India for a camera shot, while a Bengal tiger was already in the grass. It was June 7, 2017, and the morning heat had already settled across the Mahdeli buffer zone in Madhya Pradesh, a forest fringe corridor along the outer edge of a protected tiger reserve in central India. The marked trail ran narrow through dense grass and scattered trees, visibility dropping to just a few yards at the vegetation edges. Caleth Rourke, 41, was a refrigeration technician from Perth, Australia. Travel had become his way of breaking routine, and over time a small video blog had developed alongside it. Early footage focused on places. Gradually, it shifted to include himself, framing, narration, proximity. The closer he appeared to something dangerous, the more his audience responded. He had joined a small group of tourists on a buffer zone walk, arranged informally through local contacts, unauthorized, led by a freelance guide from a nearby village, moving through an unregulated fringe trail used occasionally by woodcutters and locals, outside the official patrol sector. Among the group were Dane Orfelt, 29, a graphic designer from Copenhagen who had been documenting his entire trip on social media, and Ria Schenk, 34, a teacher from Singapore on a solo holiday. The briefing before entry was brief and loosely delivered. Stay on the path, stay grouped, don't approach the grass. It was said quickly, the way something gets said when the person saying it isn't sure it will land. I wonder how many people in that group did not understand it and raised their cameras anyway the moment something moved. Late that morning, the group paused when a distant alarm call broke through the tree line. The sharp bark of a deer, then gone. The guide stiffened and held the group in place. A few seconds passed. Then a low disturbance moved through the grass ahead. Brief, then still. Dane reacted first, stepping sideways toward the vegetation edge and angling his phone backward to frame the shifting grass behind him. The guide moved toward him immediately, pulling him back by the arm. While he was doing that, Ria edged closer to the grass line on the opposite side, glancing between her screen and the vegetation, trying to get the movement in the background before it stopped. The guide redirected her sharply. The group's attention was completely fragmented. Caleth was at the rear and had not moved yet. He raised his camera toward the grass. Nothing visible. He turned the camera toward himself, angling it so the dense grass behind him would suggest proximity in the shot. While the guide was still managing Dane and Ria at the front, Caleth drifted off the path, no more than 10 feet from the group's edge. The tall grass had already reduced visibility between them to almost nothing. He lowered into a partial crouch. His back was angled toward the vegetation. He was looking at his screen. Bengal tigers are ambush predators. Adult males typically weigh between 400 and 480 pounds and can exceed 9 feet in length. They use dense ground cover to remain stationary while prey closes distance, attacking from behind or the blind side without visible approach. A separated individual within close striking distance, isolated, back turned, unaware, can trigger a predatory or defensive ambush response even in areas with regular human activity. There was a single sharp sound, brief, cut off, then a crash of movement through the vegetation, then silence. Several tourists turned toward it. There was a moment of confusion before anyone understood. By then, the attack had already happened. The guide moved the group back without entering the vegetation. Emergency contact was made with the regional forest unit. It wasn't the crouch alone that decided things. Off the path, separated by tall grass, back toward cover, attention on a screen. Each decision narrowed the margin. Together, they reduced it close to zero. Investigators documented compressed vegetation, disturbed soil, and a drag path into denser cover. Caleth was located approximately 45 feet in, shorter than typical, consistent with the tiger disengaging after the group's noise carried through. Caleth did not survive. His camera was recovered and turned over to the forest unit and was not made public. The incident was noted in local reporting, though details remained inconsistent across accounts. The informal nature of the trek was identified as a contributing factor. Witness accounts from Dane, Ria, and the other tourists confirmed the general sequence of events. What's hardest to think about is how small the decision was. He was just a step off the path, a slight shift in posture. But with an animal that lives by staying hidden, that's all the room there is for something to go wrong. Caleth left the marked path for a selfie that never got taken and never made it back. The next story shifts to Zambia, where a Dutch logistics supervisor ignored the safety rules around a hippopotamus and had no time to rethink it once the animal reacted. It was September 3rd, 2016, and the morning light lay flat and gray over the water as the group's vehicle stopped near the bank. A small safari camp had arranged the excursion along a floodplain tributary in southern Zambia's Kafue Basin. The dry season had lowered the river, exposing wide stretches of pale silt. A cluster of hippopotamuses rested in the shallows near the edge, their backs just breaking the still surface. Kalen Drost, 44, was a logistics supervisor for a mid-sized distribution company in the Netherlands. His career was built on systems, compliance structures, movement efficiency, operational control. He was effective at his work, and that effectiveness turned into a strong belief that he was always right. He had spent his professional life sorting rules that were necessary from rules that were performative, and he applied that same framework to the camp's protocols. Over the first 2 days, he had questioned restrictions repeatedly. Why the vehicle needed to stop at specific distances, why certain stretches of bank were designated off-limits, why the group held positions in areas that looked open and safe. He wasn't confrontational about it, but the pattern was consistent, and he made clear more than once that he saw the guidelines as liability management rather than genuine precaution. The guide had already observed tension early in the trip. In the afternoon before the incident, Kalen had briefly stepped outside the vehicle at a different stop before being called back without escalation. It hadn't become a formal issue, but it had been documented. That morning, the route brought the group to the riverbank where the hippos were resting close to the near edge. The water was low and still. The animals were fully visible and within close range of the bank. The guide instructed everyone to stay inside the vehicle. The bank was flat and unobstructed, with no natural barrier between the parked vehicle and the water line. Kalen stepped out. He raised his phone as he moved along the bank, framing the animal behind him, positioning himself for a selfie with the hippopotamus as the backdrop. He stopped approximately 30 feet from the nearest animal, placing himself between it and the deeper channel it used for primary water access. The guide's tone shifted immediately from instruction to panic, calling out urgently, signaling from the vehicle, volume escalating as the distance closed. That's exactly what every safari briefing warns about. It's not hidden information. It's in the written materials the camp gives guests before the trip starts. Common hippopotamuses weigh between 3,300 and 7,700 pounds and can grow up to 11 feet long. Despite their size, they can reach nearly 20 miles per hour on land over short distances. They are most likely to become aggressive when something blocks their path to water, which they rely on for retreat, cooling, and rest. Unlike many large animals, they rarely give prolonged warning before charging, shifting quickly from stillness to a direct, committed attack. The guide moved the vehicle forward and continued signaling urgently for Kalen to return. Kalen looked back. He did not move immediately. Witnesses described a pause of a few seconds, long enough for the guide to signal again before anything happened. That pause was the only window available. The hippopotamus moved out of the shallows with almost no buildup, accelerating from a stationary position and covering the distance in seconds. The impact knocked Kalen off his feet. The animal's jaws closed on his torso. A hippopotamus generates bite force sufficient to cause immediate catastrophic structural damage, and the injuries sustained were consistent with that. The animal disengaged and returned to the water. The guide held the vehicle in position until the animal had fully cleared the bank, then moved to assist. Camp staff were reached by radio. The nearest facility with any surgical capacity was more than 45 minutes from the site by road. Kalen was transported but did not survive. He was pronounced dead on arrival. Witnesses in the vehicle gave consistent and aligned accounts. Zambian wildlife authorities documented the incident, noting that the visitor had exited the vehicle without authorization, moved into direct proximity with the animal, and did not retreat after the guide's signal. The camp was reviewed and cleared of any procedural failure. Staff were interviewed and no guide error was identified. The case was later circulated among regional safari operators as a reference point for proximity error and the documented behavioral pattern of non-compliance near territorial wildlife. What stays with me is that moment he looked back. He recognized the warning, he understood it, and still didn't move. By the time he understood the danger, the space he needed was already gone. Kalen stood in the one place every guide will tell you never to stand, and the outcome followed exactly the pattern those guides describe. The next story moves off land entirely and into open water off Hawaii, where a retired traveler chose to swim toward a feeding school of baitfish as visibility dropped, and a tiger shark was already rising from below. It was January 22nd, 2014. And the afternoon light was already fading as the group entered the water off Maui's western coast. The excursion was informal, a private vessel, independent travelers, no licensed guide, no oversight. Near the surface, the water was warm and clear. Below 20 feet, visibility had dropped. Afternoon light angle combined with particulate matter from the feeding activity had reduced sight lines significantly. A mild offshore current made returning to the boat harder than it had been earlier. Mirek Zolnari, 51, had recently retired from nearly 3 decades decades as a metal fabricator in Bratislava, Slovakia. Structured environments had defined most of his life. Factory floors, fixed schedules, defined outputs. Retirement changed that. He was hooked on traveling quickly and rigidly avoided organized tours. He preferred informal arrangements that felt less structured. He carried that approach into every setting, regardless of how unfamiliar the environment actually was. That kind of independence works in many situations, but unfortunately open water in worsening conditions isn't one of them. He had joined the group through a notice at a small waterfront guest house, a casual snorkeling outing. No formal company, no experience required. The morning went smoothly, with no problems. By the afternoon, the conditions had shifted. Baitfish had moved into the area in large numbers, forming a dense, active school near the group. The clustering was visible from the surface, tight, erratic, moving in short bursts. Some participants recognized the change and started to return to the vessel. The response wasn't coordinated. One swimmer circled wider, trying to identify what was drawing the fish before deciding what to do. Another started toward the boat, then stopped and watched instead. The group fractured into separate decisions. Mirek stayed. He was carrying a small underwater camera, and the school was just directly in front of him. He angled the camera back toward himself, framing the dense swarm of baitfish behind him, positioning himself for a shot with the school filling the background. Tiger sharks are among the most dangerous shark species in Hawaiian coastal waters. Adults typically reach between 10 and 14 feet in length and weigh over 1,000 pounds. They are drawn to concentrated feeding activity, approach from below and to the side in reduced visibility, and strike with almost no surface indication. The baitfish tightened, then broke apart in sharp bursts, reacting to pressure from deeper in the water column. Whether the tiger shark had been in the area before the school arrived or followed it from deeper water wasn't something anyone at the surface could determine. The current kept pulling offshore. The light kept fading. Others called out from the direction of the boat. Mirek kept moving toward the school, erratic, adjusting his camera, generating surface disturbance as the fish scattered around him. The shark hit him from below and to the side, erupting into the surface turbulence around the baitfish. The surface broke violently. Turbulence, splashing, brief thrashing. He disappeared briefly beneath the surface, then the water flattened. The shouting came in fragments. Someone pointed. Another asked what happened. Accounts of what followed varied between witnesses. The timeline wasn't clear, and people disagreed about how quickly the operator responded. The offshore current had already moved Mirek from the point of the strike before the vessel reached the area. He was located and pulled from the water, but significant time had passed. Blood loss was severe. The vessel returned to shore. Emergency services were at the dock. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. His underwater camera was found near the site and handed over to investigators. The footage was not made public. Its release was withheld pending the formal investigation and at the request of his family. Hawaiian water safety authorities documented multiple compounding risk factors: active feeding cues, reduced visibility, an offshore current, and sustained erratic movement by the victim after others had cleared the area. The vessel operator was interviewed. No charges were filed, but the unstructured nature of the excursion was identified as a contributing factor to the delayed response. What stays with me is that the water was already saying something before anything happened. The presence of baitfish was a clear indicator. The current showed it. The light showed it. Most of the group paid attention. Mirek ignored every signal the water gave, and within minutes, the outcome followed. The next story shifts to Northern Australia, where a British traveler treated stinger warnings as optional and entered the water unprotected. It was November 9th, 2017, and the late morning heat was pressing down on a narrow stretch of beach along the northeastern Queensland coast. The water was flat and clear, the kind of surface that looks safe from the shoreline and gives no indication of what drifts below it. A small seasonal settlement sat back from the waterline, operating on tourist traffic through the drier months and mostly quiet when the season turned. Tamsin Quell, 29, was a landscape architect based in Bristol, England. Over the past 2 years, she'd built a small online following by sharing the places she visited, coastal regions, remote landscapes, and situations that produced visually striking images. A pattern had developed alongside it. She had learned to read posted warnings against what she could actually see in front of her, and when the two didn't match, she made her own assessment. Each time it worked out, the threshold moved slightly. Local residents had clearly warned her that the water wasn't safe for unprotected swimming at that time. Warning signs were posted along the beach. Stinger season along this stretch of the Queensland coast runs from October through May, and the shallow coastal waters here are documented habitat for box jellyfish during those months. Stinger suits were available at the settlement and recommended by anyone familiar with the area. Tamsin had been made aware of them, but chose not to use one. That morning, the beach was calm. The water was smooth and undisturbed. A few visitors walked along the dry sand but stayed out of the water. She stood at the edge, decided the conditions didn't match what she associated with danger, and waded in. Before she did, she held her phone out toward the water, framing herself against the flat, sunlit surface with the warning sign partially visible at the edge of the shot. Box jellyfish of the species documented documented in this region, carry venom that acts on the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, and skin tissue simultaneously. The tentacles can extend up to 10 feet from the bell and are nearly transparent in clear water, producing no surface disturbance. The animal drifts passively with the current, and the severity of envenomation depends directly on the extent of skin contact. Tamsin waded to approximately waist depth. When contact occurred, tentacles wrapped across her left arm, chest, and part of her torso before she pulled away. The extent of contact across her torso significantly increased venom exposure, triggering rapid cardiovascular distress alongside the immediate effects on her nervous system and skin. The pain was immediate and extreme, the kind that overrides everything else before the cause is even understood. She moved back toward shore, but tentacle material remained adhered to her skin, extending the contact during her movement. She reached the wet sand but was no longer moving in any controlled way. People nearby reached her, but at first no one was sure what had happened or what to do. Someone called out toward the settlement. There was no vinegar station at that section of the beach, and no one present had supplies. An attempt was made to remove visible tentacle material by hand, not an effective method, while someone else went for help. By the time additional help arrived, her breathing was labored, she was disoriented and unresponsive, and the systemic effects were already advanced. There was no medical staff on site. Transport had to be arranged under confused conditions, and the nearest facility with any capacity to treat envenomation was a significant distance away by road. Tamsin did not survive. She was pronounced dead before reaching the facility. Queensland coastal authorities reviewed the incident and confirmed the beach fell within a documented stinger zone with active conditions at the time. The absence of a vinegar station at that section was noted in the review, as was the delay in organized response. The incident was recorded as a fatal unprotected entry during an active stinger season, with inadequate first aid identified as a contributing factor. Images recovered from her camera, taken that morning with warning signs clearly visible in the frame, were retained as part of the investigative file and were not circulated publicly. In the end, the warnings weren't about what she could see, but what she couldn't. She knew the water was calm and the sun was out. Nothing she could see suggested danger. Unfortunately, box jellyfish don't really look like anything. That's exactly why the signs are there. Tamsin walked into water that looked completely safe and made contact with something she never saw coming. The next story moves away from the coast and into the forested edges of rural India, where a Czech traveler stepped outside alone at night to investigate movement in the dark, and a leopard was already moving through the area. It was April 18th, 2018, and the air had not yet cooled when the last of the evening light faded over a small village settlement on the periphery of forested hill country in central Maharashtra. The houses sat close to the tree line, separated from the forest edge by open ground, low scrub, and the fenced boundaries of livestock enclosures. The nearest district town was more than an hour away by road. Orwin Kisalik, 35, was a jewelry designer from Prague. His work dealt in precision and detail, fine metalwork, careful sourcing, controlled environments. Travel occupied the space that work didn't, and over several years he had developed a specific interest in wildlife. He didn't book any tours or go with a guide. He preferred proximity without structure, encounters that felt unmediated. That preference influenced how he traveled and how he judged the places he visited. To me, things go wrong in the choice between wanting a real wildlife encounter and actually being ready for one. He had arrived at the settlement 4 days earlier, staying with a local family through an informal arrangement. The village sat at the edge of a landscape that connected directly to forested terrain used by wildlife moving between patches of cover. In the weeks before his arrival, livestock had been taken from enclosures at the edge of the settlement, goats primarily, removed quietly and without confrontation. The villagers recognized the pattern as consistent with leopard movement. Orwin had been told about the losses more than once during his stay. He interpreted the accounts as local caution rather than documented risk, the kind of story that accumulates in small communities and grows beyond its original size. He assumed they were probably exaggerating. On the evening of the 18th, villagers advised against going outside after dark. Activity near the settlement had been noted in the preceding nights. Sounds from the scrub at the tree line disturbed enclosures. The advice was specific and consistent. Orwin stayed inside through dinner. Afterward, he heard something moving outside. The sound came from the direction of the low scrub between the houses and the tree line. He stepped to the doorway and paused, listening for a moment. The sound had stopped, but the vegetation was still shifting, a slow, irregular movement that didn't match any wind. He raised his phone, framing himself in the doorway with the dark scrub line behind him, attempting to capture whatever was moving out there as a backdrop before he had any idea what it was. Then he moved toward it. Leopards move in near total silence. An adult male in this region typically weighs between 130 and 190 pounds and carries vision adapted for low-light conditions that allows it to hunt effectively in darkness that leaves a human essentially blind. They are ambush predators that track movement using scent and wind direction, closing distance from cover without detectable approach. An individual moving toward a stationary leopard from a downwind position removes almost any advance warning the animal might otherwise give. In areas where livestock predation near settlements has become habitual, their tolerance of human proximity tends to decrease over time. Orwin moved away from the house and into the open ground between the enclosures and the scrub line, placing himself unknowingly downwind of where the vegetation had shifted. The area beyond the nearest fence was unlit. He had no torch, no deterrent, and no companion. His phone was still in his hand. The attack came from the scrub at close range. The leopard made contact from a low angle, targeting the neck and upper body. There was a brief disruption, a few seconds of movement and sound that carried back to the house, and then the scrub went quiet. The family inside heard it and waited. When Orwin did not return, they looked out and called for others. A group of villagers went out with lanterns and found him on the open ground between the house and the scrub line. The injuries to his neck and upper body were severe, and blood loss was already significant by the time the group reached him. He was conscious briefly but could not respond clearly. No drag had occurred. The sound of several people moving toward the site with lanterns had likely deterred the leopard from returning. He lost consciousness before any organized assistance could be arranged. The nearest medical facility was over an hour away by road. He died before reaching it. Forest Department officials arrived the following morning and documented the site. The attack profile, nighttime movement, isolated individual, no deterrent, proximity to the habitat edge, was consistent with known leopard encounter patterns near settlement boundaries in this type of terrain. Officials said the warnings given to him were clear and repeated by several residents. The situation was recorded as avoidable. The leopard was subsequently tracked and confirmed as a resident animal that had been moving through the settlement edge regularly in the weeks prior to the incident. Orwin stepped into the dark looking for something he was curious about, and the animal found him first. The next story moves to the Arctic, where a Norwegian engineer walked past his camp's safe perimeter alone and without deterrence, and a polar bear was already working the area downwind. It was August 27, 2013, and the light across the tundra had begun to flatten and gray by late evening, the sun low enough on the horizon to reduce contrast and compress distance. A small, privately operated expedition camp sat on a coastal strip in the Svalbard archipelago, its perimeter marked by a wire line and trip flares, standard deterrent infrastructure for any camp operating in polar bear territory. Tracks had reportedly been seen several miles downshore earlier that week. Halcyon Brevik, 47, was a mechanical engineer from Bergen, Norway. His career had been built around demanding industrial environments, offshore platforms, remote construction projects, conditions most people avoided. That background had produced a particular kind of confidence, the kind that develops when someone manages real risk over a long period and consistently arrives intact. The camp's protocols, no solo movement outside the perimeter, deterrence carried at all times, accompanied exits only, struck him as excessive relative to what his experience had already taught him. Managing risk in a controlled work setting isn't the same as moving alone through active polar bear territory at dusk. The briefing at the start of the expedition had been specific. Bears were active in the area, low-light compressed detection range significantly, and the deterrents, flare gun and sidearm, were not optional for anyone leaving the perimeter. Over the previous days, Halcyon had questioned certain measures and been visibly impatient with the sign-out process. During that period, he hadn't clearly broken any rules. On the evening of the 27th, the conditions matched exactly what the briefing had flagged as high risk: fading light, steady coastal wind, flat visibility that removed reliable distance judgment across open ground. The rest of the group stayed within the perimeter. Halcyon wanted to photograph the coastline before the light changed. He left without a flare gun, without a sidearm, without a companion, and without signing out. Before he cleared the perimeter, he turned his camera back toward himself, the wire line and open tundra behind him, and took a shot of the landscape he was about to walk into. Polar bears are the largest terrestrial predators on the planet. Adult males typically weigh between 775 and 1,300 pounds and reach lengths of over 8 feet. They track prey primarily through scent, detecting targets at distances that far exceed human visual range in low-light conditions. They don't warn you before they close in. Halcyon had moved upwind of the bear's position without knowing it, his scent carrying directly to the animal while the bear remained undetectable in the fading light. The steady coastal wind masked any sound of movement across the open ground between them. By the time something caught his eye, there was no real time left to react. The bear reached him before he could retreat to the perimeter. By the time the group realized he had not returned, visibility across the tundra had already deteriorated further. When the group found him, he was already gone. A camera was recovered near the site. The final frames showed open coastal terrain at dusk, nothing visible. The images were retained as part of the investigation file and were not circulated publicly. Search teams reached the site after the group raised the alarm. The investigation identified multiple compounding factors: solo movement, no deterrence, fading light, steady wind masking ambient sound, and an upwind position that gave the bear sensory awareness well before any detection was possible on his end. The organization's protocols were reviewed and confirmed as clearly communicated. Investigators noted that the contributing factors were each individually manageable and that in combination they had left no margin for detection or response. What's hard to think about isn't that he stepped outside, it's that he did it without the gear that could have saved him. Those protocols weren't just formalities. At dusk in polar bear territory, with wind covering sound and no backup nearby, they were his only real protection. Halcyon stepped into open Arctic terrain at dusk without the gear that might have saved him. The bear was already nearby. Next, in northern Australia, a French hydrologist crouched at a riverbank at dusk for a final photo, unaware a saltwater crocodile was just beneath the surface. It was June 14, 2015, and the heat had not yet broken when the last of the direct light began pulling off the water. A remote stretch of tidal river in the Northern Territory's floodplain country sat almost completely still in the fading afternoon. The wet season had passed weeks earlier, leaving the river lower and slower, the banks exposed, the surface carrying almost no movement at all. Elspeth Viraud, 38, was a hydrologist based out of Lyon, France. Her work centered on water systems, flow analysis, sediment mapping, drainage assessment. Standard field protocol in known crocodile zones across northern Australia was explicit. No contact with the waterline, no crouching at the bank edge, all sampling done from standing height or with extended equipment. She knew the rule. She had followed it earlier in the day. To me, it was ironic that she understood the risk well enough to follow the rules in the morning, then talked herself out of them by the afternoon. She had been out since early morning, working further downstream than planned. At 2 earlier access points, she had passed crocodile warning signs, noted them, and applied the same reasoning each time. Still water with no visible animal meant manageable risk. Her scheduled radio check-in had already passed without contact, but missed check-ins in that area were not uncommon enough to trigger an immediate response. By late afternoon, she had reached a quiet section of bank away from the marked access points. The water was calm and completely undisturbed. The light had started shifting toward dusk. She had one final sediment sample to collect before closing out the day's work. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles on Earth. Adult males in this region can exceed 16 feet in length and weigh more than 1,000 pounds. They hold positions just below the surface near banks for hours without any detectable movement. Their activity increases as light levels drop, and a crouched posture at the waterline within their strike arc is one of the most consistently documented setups in fatal encounters across northern Australia. Still water does not indicate an empty bank. She stood at the top of the bank, looking at the waterline. The surface was undisturbed. She raised her camera and framed herself against the flat river behind her, the still water filling the background. Nothing on the surface to suggest anything was there. She took the shot, then she climbed down anyway. She crouched directly at the waterline and extended both hands into the shallows, working close to the sediment. She repositioned twice to reach a slightly deeper section and remained there longer than the task required. The crocodile had been positioned near the bank below the surface, holding completely still. There was no warning movement before it attacked. Its jaws closed on her left arm, and it pulled her from the bank immediately, rotating as it drew her below the surface. She did not resurface. She was recovered by search teams the following morning, but she was gone before anyone reached her. Her equipment remained at the waterline: field pack, sample containers, and camera near the edge where she had crouched. The missed radio check-in was not escalated until she failed to return to the vehicle meeting point that evening. Drag marks were visible from the base of the bank into the water, consistent with a rapid pull from a crouched position. Investigators noted the contributing factors: late afternoon light reduction, an unassessed bank location outside marked access points, direct waterline contact in a crouched posture, and a delayed response following the missed check-in. The final image on her camera showed the river surface at dusk, flat, still, and completely undisturbed. Nothing visible. The crocodile had been there the entire time but not shown to the public. What stays with me is that she hesitated, she knew, and still went down. Calm water isn't safe, especially in crocodile territory. She knows about rivers, but she didn't realize that what made them dangerous was stillness.